Hello everyone, and welcome back. It's been a little bit, but today's video is a very special video. This video is about quite possibly the most important and central question of meditation practice and theory, the psychedelic experience, and philosophical inquiry. This is the question of the self. What is the self? Am I a self? Does the self exist? Is the self an illusion? If there is no self, what are we? These are the questions I'll be exploring in this video, and I'm extremely excited to do so. This is to me the most interesting and important question in all of philosophy, and the answer to this determines so much about how we live and interact with the world. In order to understand ourselves and know who we are, and then live in accordance with what is best suited to that, we must question the greatest assumption about our fundamental nature, that we are a self, in order to truly understand who we are. There really is no bigger question than what am I? And to provide a bit of a spoiler, the answer to this question is revealed by what we find when we look for the self, and realize that there is nothing there. So, the answer to this question comes before everything else, even who am I, and has implications on everything that comes after. Now, a lot of people have been asking me to do a video on free will, and I definitely will do that, but the insight of the illusion of self is central to the argument made from meditation for the illusion of free will, which is the argument that Sam Harris makes. And so this video is going to lay the groundwork for that, and really anything meditation related that I'm going to discuss in future videos. The insight that there is no self is at the center of both the practice and theory of meditation, and provides the basis for one's further learning and insight into the nature of direct experience and our self, or as we'll discover, our no self. In his book Waking Up, Sam Harris describes this insight of not being a self as the meaning of spirituality itself, and describes the path of spiritual practice as one of deepening our understanding of this illusion. In understanding the central truth that meditation practice reveals, that there is no self at the center of experience, we are looking at what is most primary and fundamental about our nature. And this is what makes this so important. The insights that we have about the self are the most significant insights that we can have, because they concern the most fundamental truths about who we are and our existence. You may notice throughout this video that I'll talk about the self being an illusion, and then say something about the nature of the self, or about deepening our understanding of the self, as if the self exists. Well, when I talk about the self as an illusion, I'm referring to the self as a single, unified, separate entity that exists within the mind, the one who thinks thoughts, who sees what is in front of him or her, what we think of as me, the subject who exists in opposition to the objects of the world, the thing that we are, that we identify with or as. This will be our definition of the ego self, as we'll call it. And then when I say something about the nature of the self in light of the illusion that I've just described, I'm referring to what's left after we dispel with the illusion of the self, our true self. This is what we really are, behind this illusion of a discrete self in our head that's looking out. So, essentially, there are two selves that I'll discuss. The ego, which is the illusion of self that we ordinarily identify as, and our true nature, our true self, behind this illusion. And I'll explain all of this in detail. Okay, so when it comes to understanding the illusion of self, there are two different ways to doing so. One is through the direct experience of there being no self, which meditation practice and instruction reveals, and the other is the conceptual understanding, through the philosophical approach, where we come to know through reason and inference that there cannot be a distinct, unified self at the center of experience. And just to point out, this does not mean that we don't exist at all, or that we are nothing, or anything like that. This is not a conclusion to be dreaded, or one that should inspire fear or uncertainty, but rather the opposite. As I said, to say there is no self is to say that there is no unified identity or subject at the center of our experience. We still exist, just in a different way than we thought. There is no experiencer who is having an experience. There is only experience within the context of this primary condition of our nature, as awareness or consciousness. To use more philosophical terms, there is no Cartesian mind, a non-physical soul that's separate from the body that exists within it. And I'll explain all of this and define the terms that I haven't defined already, and lay out both the instruction for experiencing this insight and the argument for its truth. Now, in saying all of that, this does raise some very important questions concerning identity and our functional understanding of our sense of self. If the self is an illusion and there is no subject at the center of experience, how do we make sense of our identity and all the things that are true about who we are? This is something which is oftentimes left out of meditative instruction in realizing the illusion of self, though with our trusty friend philosophy, we can figure out a way to make sense of this. Now, this is one of the most expansive topics I could possibly do a video on, but I'm going to try to be as specific as possible in outlining and explaining everything that I've just mentioned. In doing so, I'll utilize Sam Harris's teachings throughout Waking Up, both the book and the meditation app, and Richard Lang and Douglas Harding's work on Headlessness to address the meditative experience-focused realization of the illusion of self, which also along the way advances a philosophical argument based on a set of inferences made from truths about the nature of experience, which act as the meditation instruction. And then I will discuss Derek Parfit's philosophical conceptual path to realizing this truth, including a helpful thought experiment. I'll then discuss what we are if we are not a self, and offer my own insights in how to make sense of it all. There will be some things that I could have included that I've left out, but this will be plenty to digest already. Alright, let's get into it. Let's start with the insight of selflessness through meditation instruction. Now, in order to understand how certain instructions in meditation practice allow us to experience the illusion of self, we need to understand the fundamentals of meditation practice and the insights that it affords. The most common and fundamental practice of meditation is that of mindfulness meditation, originating in vipassana or insight meditation, which comes from the Buddhist tradition. And just to point out here, this focus on experience and the insight of selflessness is a central component of Eastern philosophy more broadly, and is at the core of Zen Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism. Although, as Sam Harris explains, mindfulness can be completely separated from its origins in Buddhism and understood within a secular context, which speaks to the value of mindfulness in offering unique insights into the mind. The practice of mindfulness consists in merely paying attention to the contents of consciousness. This means to be aware of, without judgment, whatever appears in our direct experience from moment to moment, such as bodily sensations, sounds, feelings, and thoughts. Mindfulness practice is often taught by first training one's attention to the breath, just following the sensations of inhalation and exhalation with our awareness, before then widening this trained awareness to the broader field of consciousness. Okay, so I promised some definitions, so here's the first. Consciousness. Consciousness refers to the subjective experience of being. In other words, consciousness is what it is like to have an experience. Consciousness is what it is to be aware and responsive to perception, which is essentially to say that consciousness is the primary quality of existence, of our existence. Now, I'm speaking from the perspective of direct experience here, from the first person, rather than from the perspective of science, which is from the third person, where it would be true to say that atoms, as the building blocks of all matter, are the primary quality of existence. But this is not true in our experience, which, when we look closely, is all we can directly know anyway. This is what Douglas Harding calls the science of the first person, which is what meditation is, the investigation of the subject as the subject, in opposition to the science of the third person, what we conventionally know as science, which is the investigation of objects from the perspective of the subject. That's all I'll say about that here, but I will come back to it later on. Before moving on, there are two important points I want to point out here. One is that meditation is a practice, and so it requires training of our attention in order to develop the skill. So don't be discouraged if it feels challenging at first. Just notice the sensation of it being challenging or of it being discouraging, and return to being aware. And two, this awareness that I'm speaking of is the capacity of mind to pay attention to things, to direct and widen and narrow our awareness towards things. This awareness is at the center of meditation practice. Really, it is meditation practice, and is absolutely crucial to the argument and insight into the self that I'll explain shortly. So keep it in mind. Also, I do encourage you to give meditation a try, even if it's just to get an idea of the actual practice to help you better understand what I'm talking about in this video. There's a good short 9-minute guided meditation by Sam Harris on YouTube that I'll link in the description. So if you want to do that, now would be a good time to pause the video, do the meditation, and then come back. Okay, so now that we understand how meditation works, we can see what kind of insights the practice offers. By paying attention to thoughts, feelings, and other appearances, as they appear without judgment, we can view them for what they are, as raw sensations, appearances, and patterns of energy in our direct experience. And here is the key point. We can separate these appearances from ourself, from who we are. If we can observe our thoughts rising and falling, our feelings coming and going, without us doing anything to produce them, in the same way sounds and sensations come and go, we can recognize that we are not those things. Those things are merely appearing, and we are observing them. We are just accustomed to identifying with them without realizing. As I said, we are not the appearances of consciousness, as we are able to observe them, coming and going, without us doing anything except noticing. But where are we observing them from? Are we observing them from somewhere? And what are we observing them as? Well, our default assumption and feeling is that we are observing them as the self, as me, I, from the space I am located, in my head. And it may be tempting to stop here and be satisfied with this insight. And this is where most conventional modern meditation practice stops. For example, headspace, not to discount what utility it may provide. But to have this insight into the nature of self that is the topic of this video, we have to go further. And this is where the specific teachings that Sam Harris offers in Waking Up and that Douglas Harding and Richard Lang offer in their writings and talks on the Headless Way can help us. But let's start with the practice that Sam Harris teaches, and we'll get to Harding and Lang after. So here we are, observing the contents of consciousness, presumably as ourself, from the vantage point of our mind. We've now learnt a fact about our experience through the practice of meditation. We are not identical to the things that appear in consciousness. But what if we turn our attention upon the place where we are observing from? What if we look for who is looking? What do we find? When we turn awareness around, is there a me to be found? Well, in doing this, we may recognize that this sense and feeling of self that ordinarily defines our existence and who we are is another appearance within consciousness. This is what's known as non-dual meditation practice, where instead of observing objects as the subject of the self within looking out, so there you have the duality, the subject and the object, we turn our attention upon itself, effectively dissolving the boundary between subject and object, between self and other. And so in that way we have non-dual meditation practice. And if there is no self that distinctly separates us from the rest of the world, we are not as disconnected from everything as we may have thought. Sam Harris, in his app Waking Up, which I highly recommend to learn more about the practice and theory of meditation, teaches this in the Dzogchen context, which is an advanced practice of meditation in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. The instruction of Sam's meditation practice asks us to look for what is looking, to look for the thinker of thoughts, to turn attention upon itself, to look for the self. And it is in doing this that we are granted an insight into the nature of self. By looking for the self, we find that there is no self to be found at the center of experience. There is no place I am looking out from. There is only looking. And further, we can observe the feeling of being a self as an object of meditation, as another appearance in consciousness. This itself is the insight, this experience occasioned by this kind of instruction. And by looking for the self and finding, through our direct experience, that there is nothing to be found, the boundary between subject and object, between self and other, can be dissolved, as I mentioned. By looking for the self and turning attention upon itself, we find that there is no self that is having an experience. There is just experience in each moment, which, when paying attention, we become aware of. And this is where the significance of training our awareness comes in. We are not conjuring up a specific mental state or transcending an ordinary state. We are merely paying careful attention to what already is, and ceasing to be distracted by and identifying with the appearances of consciousness. From our direct experience, we are able to recognize that beneath all appearances, we are nothing other than the space in which all things appear, the awareness that notices them. We are identical to consciousness itself. Though it's worth noting that at first, this is often only experienced in glimpses, at moments at a time, and not always straight away. But it's important to not try to force anything, and just continue the practice of awareness. As I said at the start of this video, this is the beginning of meditation or spiritual practice, and from here, the practice itself consists in deepening and nurturing this insight. While I've offered a set of instructions and statements about the nature of self that are evident from these experiences, it is not the words that are true that reveal the illusion of self, but the experience itself. And this is why these are meditation instructions to experience this for yourself. So I encourage you to do so. Though in saying this, a set of inferences based on truths about human experience that meditation allows us to recognize, such as those that I've discussed, can be made to support the conclusion that there is no self, which is what I've outlined along the way in explaining the meditation instructions that grant us this insight. However, the practice itself, the Dzogchen-based instructions that Sam Harris teaches in Waking Up, consisting primarily in the instruction to look for what's looking, without the context and explanation that I've offered, may not be enough for everyone to have this insight into the nature of self, as was the case with me. It was Douglas Harding and Richard Lang's teaching on headlessness and the Headless Way that really allowed me to experience this illusion of self and gain an understanding of it that was beyond just conceptual. I find these instructions, or experiments as they are called, along with the explanation that they are offered with, profound and complete, yet simplistic and all-encompassing when it comes to realizing the illusion of self and understanding our true nature beneath it. As I said earlier, the idea of ourself is bound up with our head, where our mind and our brain is located, and where we look out of. We might not necessarily think that our self exists only in our head, but this is often where we think it is primarily located, and where we feel located, as the place where we look out from and experience from. And in many ways, our face is associated with our identity, When we look in the mirror, we are led to believe that what we are seeing is ourself, and this is what everyone else sees and identifies us by, and so this becomes the feedback we use to identify and define ourselves. Douglas Harding, in his 1961 book On Having No Head, Zen and the Rediscovery of the Obvious, one of the greatest books that I've ever read, points out that for all this talk about us being this thing with a head, we've never seen our head or experienced it directly. And ultimately, as a matter of experience, not only are we not a self in our head, but that for ourself, from our perspective of direct experience, we have no head. If you can suspend your incredulity about this claim for now, I'll explain what this means. So the best way to do this is to explain a specific experiment and some conceptual tools that really get to the core of the Headless Way and the insights that it allows us to have, which I've learnt from both reading Douglas Harding's book On Having No Head and completing the Headless Way course on the Waking Up app. Let's begin with the first and most central experiment of the Headless Way, the pointing exercise, in the context for its theory and practice more broadly. So, the Headless Way is a path or process for discovering who or what we really are, our true nature, which addresses the central questions that I set out to answer at the beginning of this video. This is done through what's called the science of the first person, which I mentioned before, in opposition to the science of the third person, as the observation of objects as they appear from the outside, at some distance from the thing itself. The science of the first person is the observation of the subject as the subject, from zero distance, where one is able to observe themselves from the inside. This is a unique vantage point that only we as individuals are able to view ourselves from, and it is the domain of direct experience, and more broadly is the practice of meditation itself. Importantly, this is not meant to be an alternative to the science of the third person, but to complement it and to offer truths about who and what we really are that we can't know from outside, at distance, but we can know from the inside, at zero distance from ourselves. The main things to keep in mind here are that things are different at some distance from the outside than they are at no distance, at their core, from the inside. And what we are about to do is investigate and observe what we are from the inside, at our core, at no distance, from the unique vantage point of our own experience and perspective, which allows us to do this. Okay, so the first experiment, the pointing experiment. In a similar way to how I described the process of looking for the self earlier, the pointing experiment asks us to shift our attention from what we are looking at to where we are looking out of, from the objects of awareness to the subject of awareness, the self, and ultimately to awareness more broadly. The experiment goes as follows. With open eyes, point to an object with your finger, any object, and become clearly aware of the object you are pointing at with your finger, its shape, its color, and recognize that you are looking at something out there from here. Then, point to your knee and do the same. Become clearly aware of this object that you are looking at across your finger. Then, point to your torso and become aware of it as another object of awareness. You are pointing at it and looking at it, and you are aware of it. Then, turn your finger around in front of your face and point at the place you are looking out from, towards your face. What do you see? Is your face there? Is your head there? Is there an object there? Are you there? Is there anything there? And when doing this, it's very important to put aside what you think you already know is there, what you were told is there, and instead just look directly for yourself and see what you find in your experience. Is there something there to be seen? You are now observing yourself from zero distance, directly, and quite possibly for the first time. This is who you are at zero distance from yourself. This is who you are as a matter of direct experience, not a set of words or concepts that explain your experience or identity, but this experience itself, which only you uniquely can have. Only you can know who you truly are in this way. Now, like I said, this is a unique and individual experience and insight into the nature of self. So I can't tell you what you are or what experience and insight you are having when you are pointing and looking at who is looking. But given that I've had this experience, I can explain what it is like for me, and you can see if your experience is similar. And then we can try to draw some conclusions from this about the self and our essential nature. Whilst I'm doing this experiment, I see my hand and finger pointed at myself, out there in front of me. But on this side of my finger, where it is pointed towards, I see nothing. There is no self or place to look out from that I find, but instead I find open space, emptiness, which is filled with everything else that appears. Based on my direct observation of myself, in pointing at and observing the place from which I look, I am space for the world. Again, this is all about the experience of the lack of self, And in this case, this comes from pointing and looking at the place where we expect to find the self and finding nothing. So my understanding of this nothingness that I experience instead of finding a self as space for the world may not work for you, and that's okay. These explanations and instructions are meant to help make sense of and understand the experience, but are not the insight itself. The insight is an experience, which we give words to help us understand. And neither is it a feeling, it is a mere observation. But as I mentioned, I find that the strength of the Headless Way lies in the combination of the experiments themselves and the helpfulness of the explanations and conceptual tools that are used to make sense of the experience. In saying this, I'll now present one of these conceptual explanations that helps us understand this experience in terms of the layers of who we are, which is a central component of the Headless Way. First, let's recall what I said just before, that things are different depending upon the distance that they are viewed from. If we take a wooden table, for example, from a distance of 1 meter, it's a wooden table. From a distance of 1 centimeter, it becomes a piece of wood. At a microscopic level, it becomes atomic particles. Now, the table is all of these things at different layers, but it is only at the distance we view it from that it is a table, and it is with this concept and idea of a table that we identify it. At different distances of observation, things are different. In the same way, the self is made up of many layers, and appears as something different depending upon the distance we view it from. From way out in space, you appear as a galaxy. From closer in, a solar system. Closer still, a planet. And then as a city. And it is only from this close-up distance of some meters that you appear as this human. And then closer still, skin, a cell, molecules, atoms, and then at the center, which we can uniquely view because we are at this center, there is nothingness, or empty space, as we just found out. Now, you might push back here and think, well, I am this human here, and the correct distance to actually view me is where you can see that. Well, 2 important facts demonstrate that this is not true. The first is that all of these different ways that the self appears are different layers of who we are, layers of the onion, as Richard Lang says, and without any of these layers, we would cease to exist. Without the sun, without the planet, without the solar system and galaxy, the ecosystem of the earth, we wouldn't be able to exist. We are dependent upon all of these layers to sustain our existence. If we take ourselves out of our egocentric perspective for a moment and recall that there is no self at our center that separates us from the world, and that we are dependent upon all these layers to exist, we can see that all these layers are who we are at different distances. Now, this ties into the second point. We have a unique perspective of knowing who we are at no distance from ourselves, who we are at the core of the onion, beneath all the layers. And the key point is that because we can view ourselves from zero distance, we know that there is no self at the center, only the open space for everything. And as a result, we are not just this human body and appearance of a self that other people see at their distance, but a many-layered thing. But what we are at our core, our true self, is this empty, open space for the world. An open space for all of our layers. Only we can view ourselves from the center of the onion, at zero distance, because this is who we truly are. To me, this means that I am open space for everything, the light in which all things are illuminated. I am no thing, but I am also everything. And this realization is only possible by seeing that there is no self, and further, ceasing to identify with the appearance of a self in this open space. We are not the head or face that other people identify us as, that we see reflected in the mirror, but this open space, free from all appearances and identities, that each of us has a unique ability to see in ourselves. In this way, for me, I am headless. For me, I have no head. Though for you, at your distance, I do. And I find this liberating, to truly know myself, and to know that I'm freed from all the appearances and boundaries of identity. Okay, so I hope you found this helpful in experiencing and understanding the illusion of self and our true nature beneath it. And as I said, it was and continues to be extremely helpful for me in doing this. I think that the Headless Way has a very important place in understanding selflessness, and offers a very accessible way for the Western mind to understand the core insights of Zen Buddhist philosophy. But if it wasn't particularly helpful for you, that's fine. Again, if you found this interesting and want to explore it further, I recommend Douglas Harding's book on having no head and the Headless Way course on the Waking Up app. So now we have covered the experiential component to understanding selflessness and the illusion of self. We've gone through a series of meditative instructions and understood how this allows us to have the experiential insight into our lack of self, by looking for the one who is looking and not finding anything there, and by pointing to our head, where we look from, and finding that we have no head from our perspective. All of this demonstrates that by inspecting our first-person experience, we find that there is no self at the center of it. There is no I that is having an experience. There is only the flow of experience. from moment to moment, and that this sense of self, this I, is something which we can become aware of as an appearance of consciousness. Now I would like to turn to a philosophical way of looking at this, to a conceptual understanding of the lack of a unified, discrete self, so that we can see that this is true both experientially and conceptually, and hopefully deepen our insights into our lack of self, and what we are if we are not a self, which will be the final component of this video. The philosophical argument for selflessness that I'm going to present, which is the most convincing one that I know of, comes from Derek Parfit's 1984 book, Reasons and Persons, which broadly discusses ethics and personal identity. This is a highly significant philosophical text, and if this interests you, I do recommend even just reading the section on personal identity. I find the rest quite boring, to be honest, but this section is great. So to avoid getting into too much detail here and sticking to the focus of the illusion and lack of self, I'll just present Parfit's main argument for the lack of a discrete unified self, and won't focus too much on the rest of what he says concerning personal identity. And by discrete and unified, I mean a singular and separate self. Parfit's argument is presented in terms of two opposing views of personal identity, a reductionist view and a non-reductionist view. But before I get into that, I want to briefly discuss the relation between personal identity and the self. So, Parfit's discussion is not just limited to what we are, which is the primary focus of looking for the self, as we've done so far, but in who and what we are over time, and more specifically, what matters in our survival. And this is the key point. Parfit is interested in developing an account of who we are over time that makes sense of and gets to the bottom of the fact that we consider ourselves to be something that doesn't just exist now, in this moment, but that persists over time. And this is what personal identity consists in, who and what we are over time. And this gets to some more practical questions and concerns about the self, and how to make sense of who we are if we are not a discrete self. How do we understand this sense of unity that we have across our life, and all the facts that we consider essential to who we are? Which is essentially to ask, how do we accurately understand personal identity beyond a self? And in this video, we'll be considering this in light of the fact that there is no self at the center of experience. Okay, so the reductionist and non-reductionist view. First, let's cover what these terms mean, because they come up pretty often in philosophy and science. So, reductionism is the view that one thing, a theory or phenomenon, can be reduced to another more fundamental thing. For example, science generally operates on the reductionist view that all science can be reduced to physics, and further to mathematics. A non-reductionist claims that a particular phenomenon or theory cannot be reduced to something else. So, for example, the classic non-reductionist view of personal identity and self is that the self cannot be reduced to physical properties, such as the brain, and is something else entirely. So, the view that the self is a soul is a non-reductionist view, because this soul, it cannot be reduced to just merely physical properties. Parfit claims that what we generally think personal identity and our self to consist in, a separate fact, an entity of sorts that is not reducible to the processes of our brain, is wrong and cannot be demonstrated to be true. Instead, Parfit holds that personal identity can be explained in reductionist terms, where the self and our personal identity does not exist as a further fact, but can be reduced to physical terms, that is, not separate from our brains, bodies, and physical and mental events. Where meditation demonstrates the falsity of this non-reductionist view by looking for this separately existing self at the center of experience and finding that it's not there, Parfit demonstrates this through reasoned philosophical arguments. Parfit first demonstrates his reductionist view to be correct by outlining potential arguments for a non-reductionist view and showing why they are wrong. One argument for the non-reductionist view of personal identity is that we are directly aware of our continued existence over time through our memory and the content of experience itself. And this might seem to you like the most obvious reason. Like, yes, clearly I am a thing that exists over time, and I'm aware of myself as an entity that isn't just my brain processes and thoughts. Well, Parfit points out that being aware of thoughts and mental processes, facts about who we are, and our psychological continuity over time, is not the same as being aware of a thinker of these thoughts. We could not tell from the content of our experiences whether we really are aware of the continued existence of a separately existing subject of experiences. The most that we have are states of mind. When we have had a series of thoughts, the most that we are aware of is the psychological continuity of our stream of consciousness. Our experience gives us no reason to believe in the existence of these entities. Unless we have other reasons to believe in their existence, we should reject this belief. And by entities, Parfit is referring to a self that inhabits the body, that is within our mind or our body. In other words, The fact of thinking and being and feeling like a person does not equate to the existence of a separate thing that is having thoughts and experiences. Parfit then explains how this points out the flaw in Descartes' classic view that everything can be doubted, except I think, therefore I am. Lichtenberg's objection to Descartes thus survives. We can refer to and describe different thoughts and describe the relations between them without ascribing these thoughts to thinkers. We do in fact ascribe thoughts to thinkers. Because we talk in this way, Descartes could truly claim, I think, therefore I am. But Descartes did not show that a thinker must be a separately existing entity, distinct from a brain and body and various mental and physical events. So we would then need another reason to suppose that there is a separately existing self, and this might be that we have a soul, or what is known as a Cartesian ego in philosophy, which comes from Descartes' view that the soul is situated within the body, but is separate from it. Parfit then points out a crucial point of failure that makes this view untenable. Given that this Cartesian ego is not something that can be publicly or personally observable, we would have no way to know whether one ego, entirely like ours, had passed through us at some point. In accepting this view, we would have to accept the possibility that a series of egos or souls had passed through us over time, which is not something that we would be willing to accept. This then leaves us with no good reason to accept a non-reductionist view of personal identity, and as Parfit argues, we must then turn to a reductionist view, which is to say that we have no reason to suppose that we are something more than our brain and body and mental and physical events. In other words, personal identity can be reduced to our brain and thoughts and experiences. There is no I that is having all of these physical and mental events. There is only physical and mental events. There is only experience. Now, which specific reductionist view of personal identity we think is right may differ, and for reasons I won't go into, I don't think Parfit's specific reductionist view is necessarily true, but I do think that he sufficiently demonstrates that personal identity and the self can be reduced to brain processes, thoughts, and mental and physical events. And further, that everything about us, all that goes on in our brains, can be described without ascribing any of this to a thinker. An important thing to point out here, though, is that, as I said, Parfit is trying to account not only for the self, but for the self over time, for personal identity. And by not going into Parfit's view of this, I haven't yet provided an account of personal identity over time. So instead of presenting Parfit's view on this, I'll offer a more general and broad discussion of personal identity, which is what the final section of this video will be about. However, I will say that we cannot really account for anything other than the present moment anyway, as a matter of direct experience, especially when it comes to the self. Sure, we have a sense of existing over time, but that sense exists as thoughts in this moment, and further, there is no self to tie all of our past experiences to. As Parfit said, we have thoughts, but that doesn't necessarily mean we have a thinker to ascribe these thoughts to. So, as a matter of experience, it is true to say that now is all that ever exists. And this supports Parfit's argument against our being directly aware through our experience and memory of ourself existing over time as proof for a separately existing self. If we can only be aware of this present moment, and thoughts and feelings, not a thinker or a feeler, how can awareness itself be used to demonstrate a connection or unification of separate moments? And as it turns out, for other reasons, Parfit thinks that the question of personal identity is an empty question anyway, which I will get to below. Now, you can probably already see some parallels between Parfit's views and the meditation instructions that we discussed before, and this is what I initially found so appealing in Parfit's work. It seemed to me like he was offering a philosophical approach to realizing the same truths that meditation offers in an experiential way, and as far as I know, this hasn't really been picked up on. So, for that reason, I think Parfit is really worthwhile to discuss in this context, even though this was not the original context that he was writing in. Okay, so what was the context that Parfit was writing about the self and personal identity in? Well, it's in regards to survival, and what matters in our survival. So to make this really clear, I'll finish my discussion of Parfit by outlining a thought experiment he presents regarding this, and explain how it fits into this discussion. I enter the teletransporter. I have been to Mars before, but only by the old method, a spaceship journey taking several weeks. This machine will send me at the speed of light. I merely have to press the green button. Like others, I am nervous. Will it work? I remind myself what I've been told to expect. When I press the button, I shall lose consciousness, and then wake up at what seems like a moment later. In fact, I shall have been unconscious for about an hour. The scanner here on Earth will destroy my brain and body, while recording the exact states of all of my cells. It will then transmit this information by radio. Travelling at the speed of light, the message will take 3 minutes to reach the replicator on Mars. This will then create, out of new matter, a brain and body exactly like mine. It will be in this body that I shall wake up. Though I believe that this is what will happen, I still hesitate. But then I remember seeing my wife grin when, at breakfast today, I revealed my nervousness. As she reminded me, she has been often teletransported, and there is nothing wrong with her. I press the button. As predicted, I lose and seem at once to regain consciousness, but in a different cubicle. Examining my new body, I find no change at all. Even the cut on my upper lip from this morning's shave is still there. Okay, so the question is, do we survive this case? Is it me that ends up on Mars, or do I die in the process? And this leads us to wondering what matters in our survival, and what our personal identity and self consists in. And skipping a majority of Parfit's discussion, like I said I would because it's not entirely relevant, this is what Parfit ultimately has to say about this. If we return to simple teletransportation, where there is no overlap between my life and that of my replica, things are different. We could say here that my replica will be me, or we could say instead that he will merely be someone else who is exactly like me. But we should not regard these as competing hypotheses about what will happen. For these to be competing hypotheses, my continued existence must involve a further fact. If my continued existence merely involves physical and psychological continuity, we know just what happens in this case. There will be some future person who will be physically exactly like me and who will be fully psychologically continuous with me. This psychological continuity will have a reliable cause, the transmission of my blueprint. But this continuity will not have its normal cause, since this future person will not be physically continuous with me. This is a full description of the facts. There is no further fact about which we are ignorant. If personal identity does not involve a further fact, we should not believe that there are here two different possibilities, that my replica will be me or that he will be someone else who is merely like me. What could make these different possibilities? In what could the difference consist? It is hard to believe that this could be true. When I imagine myself about to press the green button, it is hard to believe that there is not a real question whether I am about to die, or shall instead wake up again on Mars. But, as I have argued, this belief cannot be justified unless personal identity involves a further fact, and there could not be such a fact unless I am a separately existing entity, apart from my brain and body. One such entity is a Cartesian ego. As I have claimed, there is no evidence in favour of this view, and much evidence against it. So, without being a separately existing thing, and the self consisting in the processes of our brain and body, we don't have an answer to this question. To ask what actually happens, whether we survive, is to ask an empty question. And I'll just point out, to help this make a bit more sense, Parfit thinks that what actually matters in our survival is a specific kind of psychological continuity, and not personal identity. Now, Parfit says a whole lot more about this, and there's a whole lot more to his discussion than what I've just outlined. But like I said, I'm just sticking to Parfit's argument for the lack of a separately existing, discrete self, and using it to support my discussion for the illusion of self. Okay, so now we can see that we have arrived at the same conclusion as meditation, that there is no self, through a process of philosophical reasoning and argument. And I think that looking at Parfit's arguments goes a long way in really understanding and being convinced of this truth, so that we can begin to operate under this knowledge in our lives. So now we know that there is no self, as an article of conceptual knowledge, as well as in our direct experience. And for better or worse, conceptual knowledge seems to hold more weight in our lives and in society than experiential knowledge. However, both are valuable and both complement each other. Okay, so while we now have this insight and knowledge, which itself is extremely profound and undermines a great deal of what we thought we knew about ourselves, we are left with a few questions. If we are not a self, what are we? How do we make sense of our identity, of our existence over time, of personal identity? And what exactly are we referring to when we are referring to ourself in light of this insight? Let's start with the first question. If we are not a self, what are we? This question asks, what is our true nature? What is the most essential quality of our being? Well, we've already touched on this quite a bit in our discussion of meditation and the Headless Way. We realized that there is nothing at the center of experience, that is having an experience. There is just experience and our awareness of it. And that the sense of self, the feeling of being a self, is something that we can become aware of as an object of meditation. So, as a fact about our experience, it is true to say that we are the light for which everything is illuminated. In other words, we are awareness. That is our fundamental quality, and is the most primary quality and characteristic of our existence, and of our consciousness itself. And without a self that is observing, that is aware, that is having an experience, we are identical with awareness itself. So we are awareness. Or, as Douglas Harding and Richard Lang would say, we are space for the world. When we lose our head, or our self, we gain the world by recognizing that we are the space in which all these things appear. We are the unchanged, unaffected space by which all things are observed. We are not having an experience, we are experience. We are consciousness, as the space or light in which all things appear and are illuminated. We are here, at zero distance. It is only when we let go of our identification with this idea of the self as a separate entity that controls and grasps things, that we can be free, as we truly are, as awareness. I find that this gives me a great sense of understanding of who I really am, beneath all the appearances of consciousness, and a sense of freedom, in that I'm no longer bound to this construct of self that only really exists as an appearance anyway, that's been informed by everything I've been taught and believed to be true. I am not the appearances of consciousness, but the primary condition of consciousness itself. So this is what we are. This is our true self. And this construct of the self, this idea that there is a me at the center of everything, we've realized is an illusion. However, while this is the case, it's important to recognize that this feeling of self, of being a self, will continue to be there. Maybe not all the time, and you may develop your ability to see through it, but to some extent or another, you'll still identify with this feeling of self, if only as an act of habit. And that is just about inevitable and very okay. The practice of meditation is to become aware of this over and over again, but not to permanently eradicate the self. So don't think of it like that, and don't try to permanently remove your sense of self, unless you want to, and that's fine, it just most likely won't work, or you'll begin to lean into a much looser grip on reality. Because it is this sense of self, what we can refer to as the ego, that allows us to navigate in the world and with other people. See the ego for what it is, but still love it. While there is no separate self that has experiences and is the locus of all the facts about who we are, there still are facts about who we are and our existence, and we still have the capacity for identity that can be properly understood within the domain of self-knowledge and personal identity, despite not truly being a self in this ego sense. Realizing this illusion of self is itself part of the journey of self-knowledge. In this way, all the facts about our past, where we come from, what we've done, what we plan to do, our values, beliefs, preferences, goals, what kind of person we are, who we are in different social situations, the workplace, none of that defines who we are. All these things are not forever etched into the being of who we are, because there is no being of who we are in that sense. Some of these things might be true, or appear to be true to some extent or another, but we are not identical to those things, or bound to them. We are not defined by all these facts, but we are free to choose how we construct who we are. We are free to craft our identity in a non-definite way, to flow with the non-discrete continuous nature of our existence and the existence of the world. But this isn't an excuse to ignore certain truths about yourself, and in order to live a meaningful, truthful life, you ought to be honest with yourself, but in a fundamentally perspective-changing way, realizing the illusion of self allows you to freely craft who you are, to know yourself, but to not be bound to yourself. And I think that is far greater than holding on to the illusion of self. I hope you've enjoyed this video and that it's been informative. I've very much enjoyed making it. Like I said, this is an extremely central topic to meditation and the psychedelic experience and philosophy. And so the idea of the self and the illusion of self will come up probably more than anything on this channel. I know there was a lot in this one, so if there's anything you want me to go into more detail on or clarify in a future video, just let me know or leave a comment if you have a question and I'll answer it. And as always, I'll put some links in the description of all the sources that I mentioned and some things that might be helpful to check out that are related to the topics of this video. These videos are also available as a podcast now, so check that out wherever you listen to podcasts if you'd like to. And also, please subscribe if you want to see more videos. And as always, let me know your thoughts and suggestions in the comments. Thank you.